結果説チチン
Welcome back to episode 3. I am on vacation now, sipping on a margarita, while lying on the beach, so I will leave it to Colin in this one. Hopefully he doesn't screw things up, and make me come back early.
Alright, now it's time to get back to business. So, I want to move all the stuff from this one room to the other room that I just finished, and make a new cutting station. And then I will sweep up all the sawdust and clean up all the garbage. Oh, I recommend to have a garbage can, preferably one you could just throw all the sawdust and other garbage into quickly. I mean, you could use a plastic bag and throw it all directly into there, but what I find through experience is that the plastic bag ends up getting holes in it because of the loose pieces of wood. When you're trying to just throw quick pieces of wood into a plastic bin, you don't care how you throw it in, and it's not going to put any holes into it. So it makes it a lot easier. And then when you're finished with everything, then you can organize your garbage. Trust me, it works a lot better, so you don't get sawdust all over your floor. Because it surely isn't fun to clean up, I'll tell you that. As I was working on this room, Blackie came for a visit around the back. He was peeking his head through the back window. He caught me off guard. It was kind of shocking when you suddenly see a cat. He was watching me work. And then, right after that, he came around to the front of the door, and he was peeking his head in the front door. Unfortunately, I was unable to touch him or pet him, as he keeps running away. He's a very cautious cat, but curious. Alright, before I do anything on this room, you first must check to see how the old top wood is and the beams are. So you just give a quick walk around on the room. And of course, in this case, I found one area, this corner here, that is very soft and squeaky. So the wood is flexing, and I need to find out why. So to do so, I just cut a small hole into the previous wood here to find out what the issue was. And I found out it was the beam attached to the side of the house came loose. So I just used a new long, thick, strong screw to screw it back in. It wasn't easy to screw back in because you had to make the hole big enough to fit your impact driver in and hold the screw on the side. And of course it keeps coming loose. But I eventually got it done. And now the floor is sturdy again. So now I can continue on with my job. Trust me, it's very important to fix these minor flaws or major flaws right away, because you don't want to find out about them after you screwed down some new beams and new boards. I've done that before and I regret my decision. So please check everything before you start anything major or new on the room. It'll make it so much easier in the future, so you don't have to go back and unscrew everything just to fix a stupid squeaking noise, which I've experienced before, and it's not fun. Now let's get started on the actual new beams. So the first thing I did was lay down some new beams to test how warped the room is. And as you can see, it's quite slanted. I used the beams to see how slanted it was from the top to bottom, and then a spare piece of veneer wood to see how slanted it was across the room. Unfortunately, it's warped in both directions, causing extra hours of work. Many hours of extra work, unfortunately. In this case, it seems that the middle of the room is higher than the edges. And one way you can fix this problem is to take up all the old wood, all the old beams, and see what you can do underneath the house. But in my experience, that's too much work. It's just not worth the pain and effort. And sometimes you can't even fix it without tearing down the whole fucking house. It's just too much work. So, my advice, the best fix, is just to fix the top and adjust your beams on top. There is no difference to safety, and you save a lot of time and money using this process. Oh, but it's so unprofessional. Don't you think you should be taking up the wood to find out what the issue is under the house? Listen, get the job done, okay? There are no safety concerns here. The house isn't gonna fall down. You're just adjusting. And on an older house, it's worth it because basically it's an old house. So who cares as long as you can use it and it looks good. And besides, when you're sleeping on the floor, using the room, or whatever, you won't even notice the difference. So take my advice and trust me on this one. Thank you. So after using some veneer pieces of wood to test the edges and compared to the middle of the room, it seems like there is a 12 millimeter difference between the middle of the room and the edge of the room. Now, from my experience, I already know what the issue is. It's the middle beam under the house that just naturally gets warped over time. And it's a super big beam. So even if I did take up the wood and try to fix it, it's impossible because it's a huge beam, which you can't replace easily. It's not the small little beams underneath. It's the biggest beam. And I find this to be a cause in a lot of the older houses. And these beams are quite big, so not only are they very hard to replace, but they're pretty sturdy and they don't need to be replaced. They last a very, 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 very long time. Even after 40 years, other than the warping, the wood is strong. So all I suggest is to build on top of it and adjust the new pieces of wood on top of it. So in this case, to balance out the room, I'll just use scrap pieces of wood, such as the veneer board pieces, and some extra mats that I had. Thank God I didn't throw those away. And some very hard cardboard pieces I had kicking around. I mean, in most cases I use other pieces of scrap wood, like really thin veneer pieces of wood, 3mm, 4mm, 5mm. They have all kinds of different sizes of thickness of veneer boards. But I don't have any on hand, so what I have on hand is these mini pieces of carpet, other pieces of 12mm veneer board, and some hard cardboard. So thank God I didn't throw the garbage away ahead of time. I've told you this before, but keep all your garbage and all your scrap wood until you finish the whole project, because you never know what you're going to need. And I always seem to find good uses of the garbage and old scrap pieces of wood. In this case, these pieces of carpet are going to become very handy. The pieces of carpet are about 4mm each in thickness, and they're pretty strong. They're basically not carpet, they're mats with rubber on the bottom, so they're very sturdy. And all you have to do is just play around with what you have and see what works, and make adjustments. All you need is a general idea of where you want to lay the beams, and you move them back and forth to see where the best and ideal position is for them. Not only distance-wise, but where you find there's less effect on the overall balance of the room. Because sometimes some areas of the beam, the main beam underneath that's warped, is higher than other areas, so it's easier just to avoid that point. So for example, if your beam in the middle of the room is warped and it's coming up and meeting in the middle of the room at the highest point, you'll try to avoid that particular point with your beams, as it'll make things the highest in the room only at that one point. So to avoid that, you just put all your beams around it so it doesn't actually touch that section, and it'll just be hidden under the old gap of the old floor, so it won't affect the levelness of your room. So just play around to see what works. But one important thing is, when you're laying the beams, you have to make sure they're at parts of the room where you're going to have your veneer boards on top of them, screwing into that section. Because you don't want to have the edge of a veneer board with no beam to screw into. So you want to do your best to make sure all the edges of your veneer boards are covered with beams underneath. Okay, once I place my beams down, I use one veneer board on top to test the different areas on the beams, to see what needs to be adjusted, to see how stable it is, to see if it's matching the edges I like, and to see where exactly I want to put specific boards, as the boards are 1820 by 910. So if I want to put a board lengthwise or heightwise, or going from top to bottom or left to right, You just have to see what feels best to suit your needs at the time and that specific room. So don't screw any beams down until you make all the proper checks. Okay, so once I put my board down, I also use a level to see how off it is. If you're lucky, it'll be level right away. But in most cases in these old houses, it's not. And you just have to adjust the beams and the little stuff that goes under them, the adjusters. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect anyways. It just has to be close enough. So when you walk on it, you don't notice it. Sometimes you can really notice it. So in that case, then you'll fix it. But most cases, you won't notice it if it's a little bit off. And don't get frustrated, because it's almost impossible to make perfect all the time. Especially when you have a room that's completely warped. It can get really frustrating. So just do the best you can, walk on it, and see if you notice anything. And in most cases, you won't. So it's okay. Your main goal here is to make a sturdy floor. So after checking the different areas, I find the adjustments I need to make. I put extra pieces of carpet, or I put a piece of veneer board under it, see what I need. I found the 4mm thick carpets or mats to be the most useful because I can put a 4mm or I can adjust it up to an 8mm by using 2 pieces. Thank God I didn't toss them on the first day when I was cleaning up all the garbage. So as long as the board feels balanced enough and you can tap dance on it without falling through, then you're good to go. So once you make sure that you feel like the beams are perfectly leveled and the wood on top fits nicely, then you can screw your beams down. You can use your 65mm or 75mm screws depending on the thickness of the beam and the adjusters used. Now you have to remember, there's one thing I forgot to mention. The beams are 30 by 40. So sometimes you can use the 30 side of the beam plus an adjuster, or you can just use the 40 side and no adjuster or some adjuster. You got 10mm to play with there as well. So for example, if part of the room is 10mm higher than another part of the room, I can use the beam on its side at the 30mm and the other beam just as is on its 40mm side, and that'll give you 10mm to play with there. You're honestly just gonna have to play around with everything just to see what works. It can take hours, trust me. As frustrating as it is, it's actually fun. And as fun as it is, it's also very frustrating. Oh, and make sure you don't trap any big spiders under the floor. I eventually did find him. Or did I? I hate spiders. Scared the shit out of me when I saw him originally. Alright, so as you can see here, I used mats and other stuff in different areas to level the floor. I did my best to make it as even as I could, and I used many pieces everywhere. It may not be normal wood, but it works, so don't worry. As you can see here, I used 12mm veneer boards, 2 pieces of mat for 8mm, or 1 piece of mat for 4mm, or 1 piece of hard cardboard for 3mm. Whatever worked. And also, of course, flipping the beams on their sides to get the 30mm versus 40mm at times. Unfortunately, none of it is exact, as that's nearly impossible, but hey, it works. Normally I would use thin pieces of wood as well, but I didn't have any on hand at the time. As you can see here, I put 5 beams for the first board here. And then 8 more for the rest of the boards, for a total of 13, giving it about 18 centimeters between each beam. The pros say 30 centimeters will do and is good enough between beams, but I don't like it, as I feel some give and flex when I step on it, and it doesn't make me feel comfortable. So I do a minimum of 25 centimeters, but honestly prefer around 20-ish centimeters per gap. So no matter how big the person that lives there is, or if they build a workout gym in the room, it will hold. I want to be able to dance, tap dance, and jump and down in the room without falling through the floor. As strong as those 12mm boards are, the bigger the gap between the beams, the easier they wear down over time. And I find if you put 20 centimeters between each beam, that they never wear down. All right, once we're confident in our beams, we can screw them down. And then next, we'll cut the big boards, the top veneer boards, and piece them in like a puzzle. Just remember, when cutting or trimming the veneer boards, it is very difficult to make perfect, but it's always better to leave a gap at the edge so there is no friction between the two boards when walking on them, because I find they make an annoying screeching sound or squeaking sound when they rub together. So it's always better to overcut a little bit than undercut. Just remember, the pieces don't have to fit exactly like a puzzle. It's always better to leave a little bit of gap at the edge so there's no squeaking sound when you step on them. And if you overcut them where they don't fit in quite yet, it's a real pain in the ass to sand down the edges or chisel down the edges to get them to fit, as I find the veneer board wood chips very easily. So I say it's always better to overcut to start with. Just a little bit though. Okay, when screwing down the veneer boards, I use 30mm by 3.3mm screws to attach the boards to the beams. So when screwed into the 12mm veneer boards, 12mm goes into the board itself, and 18mm goes into the beam. And sometimes a little more can go into the beam, as I find the veneer screw goes a little bit inside the veneer board. So sometimes you get an extra millimeter or two. But don't go too deep. However, before you screw any screws in, don't forget to mark off where the beams are touching the edges, so you know where the screws must go. You can't just randomly screw in the screws into the veneer boards. You have to make sure there are beams there. And when your beams are going across your veneer board, if you forget to mark them off, you're going to forget where to put your screws in. Because you got to remember, the beam's not touching every single part of the edge at times. The beams can touch one edge all the way down, the long way, usually. But on the short edge, there are going to be gaps. And that's another reason why you want to have your beams a little closer together, because those edges won't flex at all. And if they're far apart, they may flex a little bit, as there is no beam there to hold them down. So basically, use a red pen and mark off the 30 or 40mm gap where the beam is located. You can do this as you're putting each piece of veneer board down on top. If you try to do it later on, it's harder, but not impossible. As long as you still have a gap between the boards, you can obviously see where the beam is, unless your gap is really, really, really small. So it's easier to do it ahead of time. So once you put one piece down, mark off that piece. Put the next piece down, and then mark off that piece. Trust me, it makes things a lot easier in the end. Okay, I find the easiest way to screw the screws in is to first slightly hammer in a row of them, and then use your impact driver to screw them in. The reason you want to use your hammer first is because if you try to screw them in directly, I find the screws tend to slip. And there have been times I've screwed my finger, which didn't feel too good. The reason this happens is because the impact driver is quite powerful. So in order to avoid this, it's better to hammer the screws in a little bit and put them in. Also, you cannot wear your gloves when you're screwing them in, because I find, well, with these particular gloves that I'm wearing, garden gloves, they tend to stick to the screw, and it screws around, kind of pulls my glove off my hand. So, once again, hammer your screw in with gloves on, take your gloves off, and then screw them all in. I usually do one row at a time, because it's just easier to go boom, 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 and then to get them done. And then you move a little bit, and you do the same thing for another row. Now, the distance between the screws, depending on the location, can vary. Next to the long edges, I tend to put them 30 centimeters apart. And next to the top edge, I put them where the beams are. And in the middle of the board, it varies. I put them at different areas, depending on where I feel they're needed. The most important place to screw down are the edges. And you want to make sure the edges are very flush to the other board. You don't want to have one edge sticking up higher than another edge. So that's very important not to put edges where it's warped. Because when you put your cushion flooring on top, you're going to notice it. So just make sure all the boards are flush when screwing them down. Sometimes some veneer boards take a couple extra screws to keep them down, as the board wants to force itself from bending up because it's not even. Ever so slightly, of course, though, so not to worry. So once you get your process down, it gets faster as you screw down all the screws in the room. It's like ding, 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 boom, 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 ding, 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 boom, 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 boom. That's just how it goes. Okay, the 4.5 room is now finished. It took me 2 long days to do this room. It's so much easier when the floor is balanced already, and it usually only takes 1 day. Every room is different, so you just have to have an idea of how it works and learn as you go. I've done many rooms and found no rooms to be the exact same, especially when unleveled. The best case scenario is a balanced room, but when you're working with 4.5, 6, 8, and 10 tatami mat rooms that are unleveled, then you just have to learn as you go and go with the flow and figure it out, as you can't just say what's going to come out. If the room is 4.5, 6, or 8, or 10 tatami mats and the room is even, then you can make your calculations on the beams you need, and you can put them down quickly in the location of the beams. But when it's unleveled, you have to adjust your beams a little bit. You have to find the right heights to put them at. And every single room I've done up until now has always been different. It's never been easy. So I'm very thankful when the room is even. Yes, some of the times some of the rooms have been even, thank God. But most they haven't. As a house ages, unfortunately, the wood warps a bit. Ever so slightly. So you just have to figure it out as you go. Alright, here I am testing it. And it feels solid and wonderful. And testing it with our level, it's almost perfect. You want to check to make sure that there are no soft spots and no squeaking. And if that passes all your checks, then you're good to go. Your room is perfect. Oh, so as I was cutting all my boards, I put all my sawdust in this garbage can. And you can see here what I've collected so far. Alright, another room done, and on to the next. See you in the next one.
Okay, that's it for this episode. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one, my friends.